Harmeet Dhillon, First Amendment lawyer extraordinaire, sued Google, sued Berkeley, suing the foes of free speech everywhere. What are you working on at the moment?
Well, being an election year, this year I'm very concerned about the election being stolen by legal and illegal means, be they big tech censorship, be they ballot stuffing practices by the Democrats, ballot harvesting. So there's a number of issues that I'm looking at legally to work on this year.
Right, so how many dead people do you think will get to vote in Illinois this year?
I think this is a problem around the country. The United States Department of Justice has not, unfortunately, been as aggressive as it could be on enforcing the Help America Vote Act and the National Voter Registration Act that have requirements regarding voter registration. So big states like California, which has over 40 million people, and some other liberal states, and frankly some conservative jurisdictions as well, have done a pretty poor job of making sure that only current people entitled to vote are actually voting and eligible to vote in their states.
What's a bigger threat, Vladimir Putin interfering in the election or corrupt Democrat officials interfering in the election?
Yeah, definitely the latter. And another threat is definitely big corporations assisting the oligarchs in attempting to influence the outcome of the elections, either by suppressing conservative viewpoints, manipulating the truth, putting fake fact-checking labels on posts that are out there. These are all things. I mean, from California, for example, one of my members of Congress in California had a fake news label applied to a factual tweet that he did just last week. So this is a big concern.
On the tech companies thing, what amazes me is how often you have the CEOs of tech companies going up before Congress and appearing to just blatantly mislead them. So we had Sundar Pichai go up before Congress, I believe a year or so ago, saying, we never manually intervene in searches. But just over a week later, we released internal material from Google. Google employees admitting they do manually intervene in searches.
Sure.
One Google employee said, we have lots of black and white lists for search that we manually curate. So are these tech companies essentially lying to Congress now openly?
They are lying to Congress. Unfortunately, the Congress members are, many of them, technologically illiterate. They don't know the right questions to ask, and they don't have the competence to ask the follow-up questions that are required, and apparently neither do their staff. So they aren't held accountable for this. And just last week we had billionaire Mike Bloomberg openly say that he bought 18 congressional seats. Well, any of those tech oligarchs could actually say the same thing. They're a little more subtle about it, but in fact, by suppressing the election ads of prominent Republicans running for election or re-election, Marsha Blackburn on free life issues, for example, they are effectively giving an in-kind contribution to the Democratic candidate in all of those races. And it's really always one-sided. I have yet to see a case of a Democrat candidate's speech being suppressed, manipulated, labeled as fake news, or otherwise downgraded compared to the Republican.
So, YouTube has admitted that they've taken down, they've disclosed that they've taken down over 300 of President Trump's ads. This just strikes me as extraordinary election interference and a total break from what YouTube used to be, this open platform for everyone to use. So how badly do you think tech bias will affect President Trump's chances in the coming election? Do you think YouTube's behavior and Facebook's behavior will get worse in terms of taking down official presidential ads?
Well, I think we can't predict that it will get worse. And so the issue we face as lawyers and policymakers is what is the correct solution to that. On the one hand, the libertarian in me says that I don't really want a sort of equal time rule on the internet because I don't want the government policing that any more than the government does a good job of doing anything else, really. But on the other hand, all of these tech companies make promises to consumers, including people who buy ads. They're consumers. The Trump campaign is a consumer. And if the promise to the consumers is if you put forward an ad that meets our criteria, we will run it, then they should be held responsible for that. If it was any other type of company with any other type of speech, that company could sue somebody who violates their rights. But somehow, because of the Communications Decency Act 230, that's being used as a very broad shield against liability by these big tech companies. I think that's an issue that's really crying out for regulatory reform. Unfortunately, politicians on both sides of the aisle are getting big contributions from these big tech companies, and they're effectively paying protection money to these politicians to look the other way. And that's a huge problem.
Yeah, there's a love affair between Silicon Valley and the swamp.
Absolutely.
I can't think of...
Bipartisan, I might add. Every Republican also likes to go and do the tour of Google and act like they're doing something about it, but in fact there really is nothing being done to check to check these issues. And this is an issue, Alam, that's actually much broader even than our American election. It's an issue of global domination. It's an issue of China utilizing censorship tools from these big tech companies to suppress their own people, to put people in digital cages. That's a huge problem, and it's a problem that could end up affecting the liberty of all of us.
And we now have a social credit score emerging in the US, is what Silicon Valley is building. Every user of a platform will have this hidden score that determines whether they get to stay on the platform or not.
Absolutely.
And that will be linked to how well you comply with Silicon Valley's far-left values.
Absolutely. I feel like I'm shadow banned regularly on Twitter. It used to be the case that people who went on TV for a TV appearance would immediately see a bump in their followers. That's no longer the case for many of the more prominent conservatives of the president, and I'm one of those. And then you have certain self-appointed or implicitly authorized censors who are users, like many transgender activists, for example, have become very militant about labeling anybody as a hate speech proponent if they simply have a traditional viewpoint about gender. And people are regularly being deplatformed for that.
Yeah, meanwhile, the left gets to threaten violence against high school kids and get to keep their verified check marks.
That's correct. You can be an Antifa with an anonymous account threatening violence regularly against normal Americans. But if you dare use the wrong gender, you are banished for life. So
one question I have is about the legal relationship between the users of tech platforms and the platforms themselves. It seems like users have absolutely no rights in relation to the platforms. And when you compare it to like a different industry, like, for example, housing, a tenant has rights in relation to the landlord. The landlord has to follow a strict legal due process before evicting a tenant, whereas you could invest, a decade into building up a social media presence. It could be worth millions of dollars, and that could be taken away from you without any due process whatsoever. So do we need a kind of a digital bill of rights that gives users rights, legal rights, and the right to due process in relation to these tech products?
Yes, absolutely. So this is a very interesting problem of regulation in general if you step back and look at this issue. The Communications Decency Act, Section 230 protection was put into place at a time when the internet was a new thing, and members of Congress thought it was a kind of interesting thing that wasn't going to come to much, but they wanted to make sure that there was some protection for these new America Online dial-up platforms where something offensive might go over their lines. They wanted to hold them not liable, just like a Verizon or some other telecommunications carrier should not be liable for the speech that's transmitted on their equipment. What that's evolved into is a special protectionism and a special safe harbor for these entities. And these entities have used that shield to grow into multi-billion, almost trillion-dollar corporations. And now they no longer need special protection. They're, in fact, the most powerful corporations in the world. And yet they are deploying this safe harbor to suppress the speech rights of Americans who effectively have been told that if it's this company violating your rights, you have no recourse. This is a huge problem, and I think it's going to require regulatory reform.
One thing which fascinates me, quite infuriating, is that tech companies rely on was essentially a handout from Congress,
That's
a
right.
special legal privilege that no other company has.
Correct.
And yet all of these conservative think tanks, virtually all of the big ones say, well, we can't reform this law, that would be government interference, government
That's
regulation.
exactly right.
But it's actually taking away a government handout. So it really shows you how deep Google's influence goes in conservative ink.
Absolutely. They have managed to purchase protection with their protection money, purchase opinions from all of the major conservative think tanks to varying degrees. Even, CPAC has had Google as a sponsor here, which affects the type of speech that goes on in these types of platforms. And they're effectively gaslighting us, as you just put it very eloquently. What we're asking for is a special protectionism, which is, of course, is not a conservative concept to be taken away. And yet we are being called regulators. The opposite is true. We would like a level playing field for industries, and this is an industry. It is an industry that should be treated the same as every other industry. If a car company makes promises to me about the 0 to 60 speed of its vehicle and it is lying, I can sue them as a consumer in a class action and hold them liable. Yet, if Google, Facebook, or Twitter lie to consumers about how they run their ads, how they host their content, what are their criteria, if they label me defamatorily as a hate speaker, I have a legal recourse, but I don't have a legal recourse against the big tech companies. So we need to end that and put them back on a level playing field.
Final question. You've dealt with free speech controversy in a number of areas, college campuses, big tech, Antifa attacking people in the street, attacking journalists. One other area, you're a big knitter. I hear knitting has become political as well. That
Yes,
you can't be a Trump-supporting knitter now.
Well, there is the most popular fiber crafting website is called Ravelry. I am a member of Ravelry for many years. I do not bring my Trump-supporting self there because it's not relevant to knits and pearls and sweaters and things that I make. But it's unfortunate that, yes, that community has become affected by Trump derangement syndrome to the point where many knitters feel like they're not welcome. And people who believe in handcrafting things, they often are conservative. So a lot of the women and some of the traditional rural users of that website feel alienated from it. It's really unfortunate.
Yeah, everything is politicized these days.
Right.
Gaming, comic books, knitting, everything.
Everything is. It's sad, but I'd love us all to get along and be respectful of each other's opinions. Unfortunately, we seem to be far from that norm right now.